In June 2002, police in the town of Krasnofimsk, Sverdlovsk province, Russia, received a call from a young woman reporting that she had found her grandmother murdered when she visited her house as usual. Upon arrival at the scene, the police discovered that clothes in the closet and items in drawers had been ransacked and thrown haphazardly on the floor. The body of Mrs. Sosnick, in her 80s, was found lying face down beside the wardrobe, with her skull fractured. The police collected several suspicious fingerprints at the scene, but no suspects were identified after cross-referencing with the fingerprint database. Before any progress could be made on the case, a second murder took place. The victim was also an elderly woman living alone who died from being struck on the head from behind with a blunt object. Her home had been rummaged through. Police found matching fingerprints from the previous crime scene and concluded that the same individual was responsible. In the following months, the previously peaceful town of Krasnofimsk was shaken by 3 more murders. The victims were all women between the ages of 70 and 80. Given the brutal nature of the murders, police deduced that the killer was likely a local man in his 30s, familiar with the area. The intense investigations by authorities and the growing attention from residents seemed to make the killer wary, as there were no more incidents for a long time. In 2005, Mrs. Morshayeva became the target of the killer. After hitting the elderly woman twice on the head with a hammer, the assailant was likely frightened by the victim's screams and fled the scene. Mrs. Morshayeva narrowly escaped death due to wearing a thick leather hat. Neighbors also heard the screams and saw the assailant's silhouette through the peephole in their door. Police were stunned when witnesses described the killer as a blonde woman. Initially, they suspected that the witness had been mistaken or that the perpetrator had disguised themselves as a woman to throw off the investigation, as serial killers using such violent methods are typically male. However, Mrs. Morshayeva was adamant that she had been attacked by a blonde woman in her 30s. She reported that prior to the attack, the assailant had posted a notice on her door claiming to be a social service worker and asking her to stay home on the day of the crime to inspect the gas. She complied with the instructions, opening the door at the agreed time only to be attacked unexpectedly. During her struggle, she managed to pull out several strands of the attacker's hair. Based on the witness's description, the police released a sketch of the suspect and appealed to the public for leads. Authorities questioned residents in hundreds of homes and local social service offices, searching for all blonde women but found no results. Sometime later, an 80-year-old woman named Mrs. Bratukina was found dead in her home in Ufa, more than 200 kilometers from Krasnofimsk. The killer left a note at the scene, identifying herself as an employee from a housing services office. Police collected fingerprints, questioned all employees of the housing services office, and reviewed the records of tens of thousands of local residents, but they were unable to link anyone to the crime. With no leads, the killer became bolder. She posed as an employee of an electricity and gas supply company, committing further crimes in Yekaterinburg and Nizhny Tagil. In some cases, she attempted to burn tablecloths with an electric iron to cover up her crimes. The police eventually detained a suspect, Marina Valieva, a 29-year-old unemployed woman with a history of drug addiction and a strong disdain for the elderly. After several days of interrogation, Marina confessed to the crimes. However, even as the media reported that the serial killer had been apprehended, another murder took place in May 2010. Neighbors of Mrs. Povanesina, an 81-year-old woman living alone in Ufa, notified the police after noticing she hadn't gone to the market in 2 days as she usually did. When they saw that her door was closed and received no response after knocking, hearing only the sound of her cat crying, they called the authorities. Police forced the door open and found the elderly woman lying face down in her bathtub. Marina, who was initially considered the perpetrator, claimed that she was tortured and threatened by the police to force a confession. She was later released, and several officers involved were sentenced to prison for abuse of power and evidence tampering. Devil in a Dress and She-Wolf of Krasnofimsk were nicknames given by locals to the person who had murdered 17 elderly women over the course of 8 years. She was likened to a demon lurking in the shadows, constantly searching for her next victim. The case took a major turn when a neighbour of Mrs. Povanatina provided the police with a critical lead. This individual recalled that shortly before the crime, Povanatina had hired a female painter from a nearby locomotive depot to help repaint her walls. The appearance of this painter resembled the sketch of the suspect. In early June 2010, after an in-depth investigation and interviewing more than 3,000 people, the police identified Irina Gaidamarchuk, a 38-year-old painter without a passport. Authorities found a blood-stained hammer at her residence. Irina's fingerprints and handwriting matched those left by the perpetrator at the crime scenes. After comparing her DNA to hair strands pulled out by one of the victims, police confirmed that Irina was indeed the killer responsible for the 17 consecutive murders. On June 7, 2010, police arrested Irina. During questioning, she confessed to the crimes. Irina Gaidamarchuk was born in 1972 in the town of Nyagan, within the Khanty-Mansi autonomous area. In her teenage years, Irina began drinking heavily, especially vodka, due to her parents' influence. In the early 1990s, Irina moved to the town of Krasnofimsk, far from her hometown, married, and had 2 children. However, she couldn't break her vodka habit, which caused tensions in her family life. Irina's husband refused to give her money, fearing she would spend it all on alcohol. Despite her addiction to vodka, Irina was described as a good mother who was polite to her neighbours. With no stable job and under strict financial control from her husband, Irina did everything she could to get money for alcohol. Irina had an inexplicable hatred toward elderly retirees. She planned to rob elderly people who lived alone, believing they had significant savings. Irina would go to residential buildings to scout, select suitable targets, and observe when they left their homes, where they went, and whether they had any relatives visiting. After gathering enough information, she posed as a social services worker to gain their trust. Once inside, she pretended to use the bathroom or get a glass of water to scope out the surroundings. When she was sure no one else was around, she attacked her victims from behind. After committing the crime, Irina searched for cash but avoided valuables, thinking they were harder to sell and could lead the police to her. To delay the discovery of the bodies as long as possible, she locked the victims' doors upon leaving. All the stolen money went toward buying alcohol. The police stated that she managed to steal only around £1,000 from all her victims combined, sometimes finding as little as £20. After Irina's arrest, her family and neighbours expressed shock, as she had maintained a respectable image. "I lived with her for 14 years and never suspected a thing," Irina's husband said. Once, a neighbour saw the suspect sketch released by the police and joked that Irina looked a lot like the suspect. She only smiled, showing no fear or unease. On February 13, 2012, Irina stood trial for 17 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 18 counts of theft. She claimed she killed because she had no money to buy vodka. A psychiatric evaluation determined that Irina was slightly paranoid, but had no mental illnesses. On June 4, 2012, Irina was sentenced to 25 years in prison, later reduced by 5 years because she had young children. Under Russian federal law, the maximum sentence for women is 25 years. The sentence outraged the victims' families. Just over a year in prison for each life. She should never deserve freedom, one family member said. What do you think about today's case? Please leave your comments below so we can discuss it together. Don't forget to support us with a like and subscribe to the channel to motivate our team to bring more dramatic cases. And that concludes today's case. Thank you, dear viewers, for watching. Goodbye, and see you next time.